We have a lot of unions, we have a lot of associations, civil society organization. Can we also situate inclusive advocacy? And I say this, that when people go to conversations to advocate either for change in any sector, can they always look at the quota within the quota? And so you're talking about women. I'm also thinking the minority within the women group, which are the women with disability.
This season of the Unamplified podcast is sponsored by the GIZ African Union Aware Project. A project aims to strengthen women's representation and participation in political processes.
Welcome to another episode of the Unamplified podcast. My name is Cynthia Mbamalu, your host, and with me today is my co-host.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Unamplified podcast. My name is Queen CY, always coming with the vibes.
Yes, she says she comes with the vibes. I don't know about that. I'm going to steal from your vibes someday. So, today we're discussing representation versus participation. And I remember the story my dad told us while we were younger. So I come from the Igbo speaking parts of Nigeria. And where I come from, being a chief, the chieftaincy title is big. So in those days, when you go for a meeting, if your family has a chief, the chief is the one who speaks for your family, who represents the family. If you don't have a chief, when the chiefs are speaking, it means your people, your family wouldn't have a representation. And so my dad's family, he said then they had raised money because it was expensive for chieftaincy title. So they raised money and they said they'll sponsor one of their uncles at the time to represent them. And so they raised the money, he got this chieftaincy title, and then they went for a meeting and then they said, all the chiefs, they would go for an inner meeting in the inner room. And then they said they would give them special meals. So they sent special delicacies, different kinds of meat to the chief. They thought their uncle would bring some for them, as far we all contributed to this chieftaincy title. But then he goes to this meeting, he's inside, he eats everything, he comes out. Other chiefs came out with things like meats and gave their family like, oh, this is my share from the meat. This uncle does not come out with anything. They ask him, okay, what do you put discuss? He says nothing. Now, unfortunately, the uncle did not have a car, but they had come with like what we call like a Hilux, a truck for the meeting. And he was sitting in front with them. So they all got angry. And then they said, because you did not get us food, you're going to sit behind. You know, the open part. And the road to the place was so bad. It was bad road. So my dad said, they told the guy driving that, ensure you enter every ditch, ensure you enter every bad road, that this guy behind, the dust and the dirty water must splash on him. So as they were driving back, the man kept shouting that, why are you taking this road? This ditch, must you go into this ditch? They didn't answer him. So when they got back, they told him, you ate all the food because you were the chief. That don't worry, we'll all go and make money and we'll all get our own chieftaincy title. And when I thought about the story, it made me think about participation and representation. Because most times when you're in the room, you understand what is happening. You then ensure that your needs or your interests are properly catered for. But if you're not in the room, you don't know what decisions are being taken. You don't have your voices heard. And so today, while we are discussing transforming systems, looking at representation and participation, we have two powerful women who will be joining us in this conversation. We have Adora Onyechere Sydney Jack. Welcome to the Unamplified podcast.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's great to be here.
Yes. And we have Nerima Wako Ojiwa. I hope I pronounced that well. Joining us all the way from Kenya, Siasa, please. Welcome to the Unamplified podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So Queen CY, representation and participation. Is there a difference?
There's a difference, but then again, when you differentiate both of them, you are taking away something huge from it, because in participation, individuals get to vote for their leaders, get to participate in protests and all. And representation, if these individuals, they're not represented, maybe after participating in their election and this and that, they don't represent or take part in the decision-making process, it creates vacuum between the public input and policy outcome.
Let's hold the brakes on this. Because now I have two experts in the field. I'll begin with Nerima and then I'll come to the studio. Nerima, you've done a lot of work when it comes to advocating for inclusion. Is there a difference between participation, and representation? And can you have participation without representation or vice versa?
That's a good question because, as Quincy was also describing, it's something that we're constantly pushing for. So we can definitely feel the effects of having terrible representation. And that means even with our members of parliament or legislators here, we definitely fight because our constitution actually gives us direct power as Kenyans to participate in every single process when it comes to law and decision making, which frustrates our parliament. So they have to come up with certain quotas of public participation. And what we have seen is them having tokens, basically public individual citizens that they have selected that they know are their allies or friends, and then making sure that they're able to go for a meeting, they don't discuss anything, and these people sign the registration and say, we have participated in the process. So they try and find loopholes toward that participation. So I'd say representation is important, participation is important. They have different levels of engagement, which are equally important. I wouldn't say one or the other. If we could have both, then we're in the sweet spot. Because even when we talk about young people's representation, people will argue, all of us have been young before. So we understand what young people need. Why must you have somebody below the age of 35 to feel represented if laws are built to be inclusive? But we've also seen how the dynamics of the world in terms of issues from climate change to environment to technology, and these younger generations are coming firsthand with some of these challenges that previous generations have never interacted with. So you're beginning to see why representation is equally important in some rooms. So I would say both.
Yeah, to Adora, do we have a difference between participation and representation? And can you have one without the other?
From my own school of thought and experientially, because I've run elections and I'm also an advocate for women. So those are like two sides of the same coin. But I would say that representation and participation are interrelated. However, distinct based on political leadership. And I will explain. So you have descriptive representation and you have substantive representation. Descriptive representation is talking about the proportion or the number of women within that representation. So you're talking about House of Rep, Parliament, councillors, all of that. And then you're talking about substantive representation, which means that those women who are being voted, are they also advocating for women's rights when they get into the room? And that's also bouncing off on what Yerima said, that even if you have the power to be in the room, what are you saying? How are you advocating? What are the conversations that you're amplifying? So those are like the dissects. Again, you come down to the fact that when you're thinking participation is a broader conversation, an ecosystem that involve activism, campaigning, election, the media, the civil society organization. So it's a whole ecosystem when it comes to participation. And so those who run for elections can be participants and also run for elections. But those who participate don't necessarily have to run for elections to participate. So it's a whole ecosystem. But I think that, when you listen to the one and the same, we are now really demanding that those who are participating do also come out for representation. Because, the quest of just asking when the numbers are limited, why don't you step into the fora and say, I've done enough of the acts and I want to really intensify through putting myself to the test and running for election to test what we have been advocating for. So beyond participation, I think that it's a chain reaction. I would say that representation and participation go hand in hand, but one must be able to leave the comfort zone to amplify the other at the end of the day.
To leave the comfort zone to amplify the other at the end of the day. And Nerima said something around, like people would say, oh, we've been young before. We can speak for young people. So why do we need to have young people in the room? Absolutely. The same thing, you have some men who say, oh, I have a mother, I have a sister, I have a daughter. So I know women issues. Absolutely. So why do we need women in the room? I I mean, once upon a time in Nigeria, we had commissioners of women affairs who were men.
Absolutely.
I mean, that was really embarrassing. I don't even know how they felt comfortable to sit in those seats, right? But I think from both of you, that's one of the things I'm hearing, that participation is key. Our laws and constitution guarantees that. But then you can participate and still not be represented, which is why it's important to move beyond participation for representation.
Okay, to Nerima, does Kenya's system encourage women participation in governance?
It does. So we have a clause within our constitution that pushes for affirmative action. So that's why we have the women representative seat. So we have 47 counties, which are like the 47 states. And each county has a women rep, which is basically a member of parliament. They have voting rights, and they are also allocated a budget. However, it comes with its challenges. Because of that position, you will find when we're in a political season, elections, especially young women who are interested in politics, they're encouraged to go for that seat. So they're told, women have a seat, why don't you go for that seat? You know, removing them from competing for governor, for Senate, or for member of county assembly, which is the lowest kind of position that we have, which is the closest to the village level. So we call that the ward level. And I say it's a challenge because within our constitution, we push for 2/3. Basically, we can't have more than 2/3 of the same gender within our institutions, within our commissions, committees, and parliament. And the challenge comes where the women rep position was supposed to bump up these numbers. But what we're seeing is we end up having a lot of men going for elective seats. And so when you talk about how many young women were elected, and when I mean young, I say below the age of 35, out of 330 young members of, say, county assembly, only 14, 14,
Wow.
yeah, were women. And so you can see that even though when we have this constitution, we're seeing a decline, it's not much of a rise. And when we look at governor position, 47 governors, we have 7 who were elected in 2022, but 1 has already been impeached as recently as 3 weeks ago. Another is currently possibly going to be impeached. So we might have maybe 3 governors by the time we get to 2027. So you can see how difficult it is for women in our government, but also the fact that we had a Supreme Court justice, our former Chief Justice, David Maraga, not the one that's there currently. He actually dissolved parliament on the basis of it doesn't meet 2/3. It has fewer women and they need to resolve this issue. So he dissolved parliament until today. And this happened almost 6 years ago. Until today, people have ignored, that dissolution. So it's something that is still a huge issue that a lot of women's rights groups continue to push and make sure government listens or tries to listen.
So I want to ask, based on what you just said, that just 14 women was elected in office, and what are the challenges? What are the causes? What is causing this low representation of women in political spaces in Kenya?
It's a variety of challenges, from the resource and how expensive it is just to run for office. I think Kenya has one of the most expensive election cycles as far as bribery goes, and also how our elections cost, considering the size of our country. And even when we talk about, women's participation, the violence is actually growing. Even right now, we're not even in an election period. Our next election is 2027. But as recently as Sunday, there were political goons that vandalized a church where people had gone for a political rally. So you can see even about 2 weeks ago, the president was doing some campaigns across the country. In his campaigns, about 4 people died because of his motorcade and just the violence of the gangs that were surrounding him and the number of people who were robbed, who are attending that particular rally. So we're seeing our politics becoming more and more toxic, more and more insecure. So you're seeing a less number of young women or even women choosing to go for those political seats, and the finances, which I've already mentioned. There are groups here that are encouraging women to enter politics. Some of them have already started fundraising through we call them chamas, like the circles, the table banking, and encouraging women to now start saving towards supporting women and mobilizing for women to enter politics. So there's that as well. And also just the dynamics. I know even in Nigeria, you go through that, where when a woman joins politics, it's just difficult for the family. A lot of the bullying that happens, a lot of the public imagery that's painted about them being these terrible women, it's very, very hard for some women. And they end up breaking families, losing their families, and some of them are discouraged, first of all, by their spouses. And so we see a lot of people being too afraid to come out politically. So that also reduces their participation greatly.
Wow. When you were talking, Nerima, it felt like this was Nigeria. So it's like you just take Kenya out and put Nigeria and almost similar. No, we won't feel Kenya is doing better than we are when it comes to women representation, because we cite Kenya as an example when we advocate and push for legislation here in Nigeria. So, Adora, you wear, I would say, 3 hats now. This is more than dual hats, because you're in the media space. You've been there, award-winning also. You've also engaged in the electoral space, both as a candidate and as a voter. But you've been also a big voice when it comes to advocacy for women inclusion. And then you're an author. You wrote a book recently. You want to tell us about the book and why you wrote the book? Very interesting title.
Cynthia.
Very interesting title.
Okay.
So what are those structural barriers or challenges you've experienced so far? Like you had to, at least both in the media space, in the society, in politics generally. What are those challenges, and how do we begin addressing these challenges in Nigeria?
I think that there are quite a myriad of, issues, and they cut across sections from structural to institutional and even to social. Yeah. And I first of all start with the electoral space. I would always say this: how many, electoral commissioners, are female in INEC? I start with that. True. Because for me, I ran a very localized election. I went to represent my constituency at Okigwe, back in Imo State. And I think I moved back home a year before election. So I was intentional to study, to background. And from not just knowing where the polling centers are to finding out who the electoral, umpires are, I found out that there were very limited female voices within that space at the local level when it came to election monitoring, election observation from the side of INEC. Again, I would also say that political parties here, failed to do its due diligence by looking at their quota system in terms of their numbers and percentages for women who are within political parties to run for elections. So you see where they do the tokenist approach, where women can approach and, ask for the nomination forms, and then they say they're giving women 80% free nomination form, and they don't necessarily get to primaries. And at the end of the day, those who even manage to get the forms some of them are delisted if they refuse to pave way for the men. And then when they eventually do that, they now co-opt them to mobilizing for the men instead of mobilizing for the few female voices that actually make it to the poll. So again, like I said, the political party. So I think that I would also want to look at our legislation. I mean, Kenya does have, an inroad, even though I know she talked about the Achilles heel. Yeah. However, I think that they already have a road to having voices and hands on the table. Nigeria has none. I mean, so that's why I was laughing that we're not even nowhere near, to Kenya. We're scratching the surface. And so what that means is that I would love us to get to the place where Kenya is at the moment with legislation. We're talking special seats, extra seats, section 48 and 49, section 91, and I think section 71 and 117 in the Constitution is looking at 1 seat per Senate, and the House of Representatives, and 3 seats, for women at the House, at House of Assembly, and then creating special seats for women directly just for women, which is what she, alluded to. But then again, I often worry about this because of one, we have a very masculinized parliament. And even though we have seen this energy, I saw it when the 5 gender bills were presented.
Yes.
Signatures were gotten. There was so many, enthusiasm that yes, it's about to be Uhuru and a record for women. But when it came down to the real time to vote, the men voted against it unanimously. So again, I'm going back and I'm tongue in cheek. I'm seeing all that they are doing at the parliament, but hopefully beyond the constitution review, when we get past the voting, you need a 2/3 of the state assembly, which is directly under the governors, who are the emperors of the state. So you are asking how we're going to surmount the way. And then that brings me to participation. This is where voices are needed to begin to push for structural change. That's just to address your question. And so if we are able to look at the structural demand using participation and voices, we may necessarily not get all of the numbers at the same time. But when we do have legislation, it puts women on the table to at least start the conversation. And it then gives us a buffer to begin to weigh, okay, the national gender policy has revised. How do we also look at amplifying that? Because women are already in the room. If you do not have legislation, you just have a policy that is workable, but is not implemented. So until we have women representation in the parliament, we can then think about implementing policies. But if we still have the kind of patriarchy we have in our politics, it may be very long in the running. And then I would also want to add this. Again, I would want to say the media, has a lot of role to play. And I say this because elections are first won in the minds from what people see, what they hear, how the conversations are positioned and stereotyped. And whether we like it or not, the men have the finances because they have godfathers. And so they bully this space, whether it's in the media or in the local spaces, to be able to say, if you have the money, then if you say you are equal to the men, let's run that path. So the media needs to be able to incentivize the space and begin to look at capacity, need to look at popularity, and also need to start asking political parties questions about their constitutions. And I think when we begin to amplify the lacunas within the political parties, when they know that they can be named and shamed, I think that way we are able to push forward the narrative that participation is working for representation.
Wow. This is, just listening to Adora share the experiences from Nigeria, and then Nerima, at the top of I'm just thinking, is it possible to change this current system that we have? Because Kenya, you have a constitution, but the challenge is implementation. You have a court decision that dissolved parliament for not meeting the required threshold, but it wasn't enforced. And so at the top of my mind, I'm thinking beyond just what we have in the law, as we engage in a society. I know, for instance, Nerima, you're one of the strong voices from East Africa, actually, and within the continent, speaking around inclusion, challenging status quos and questioning authorities that are abusive. Is it possible to change this current system that we have in a way that it enables better representation and promotes participation? And are there innovative ways of achieving this or doing this?
Absolutely. So there's 2 things that happened last year. I know in Kenya, a lot of people remember the June 25th protests where people stormed parliament. But earlier that year, actually, there was a women's march where there were thousands of women who across the country were marching, protesting, end femicide. Basically, statistically, we lose a woman every day to femicide, and we lose, yes, we lose about 40 in a month. And this is as recent as the information that we received from government in a report about 2 weeks ago. And so in the end, government ended up establishing a commission to reduce the femicide cases in the country. So the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is to just demonstrate how women came together under this movement and femicide at the beginning of the year. And it's actually through some of that organizing, we had the protests that ended up rejecting the finance bill in June. And the last protest at the end of the year in December was another protest that was heavily organized and attended by women to end femicide again, basically bringing the issues back to the fore, basically saying these issues haven't been resolved. And this is when government decided to create this commission to look into the issue and give 100 million shilling budget toward that. And even right now, there are interviews going on because the cabinet secretary for gender, that position was abolished after the protests, but now they are doing interview processes to bring it back up again. So you can see the power that women have when they come together and they organize and they mobilize. What I do think is public is yet to understand why this role is extremely important. Unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot of the women reps coming out in solidarity to protect their own. Mainly, they haven't been at the forefront of the end femicide movements. One of them tried to at one point, and she was kicked out of the protest. So they still have a lot of building solidarity with community women as well. But the public is still yet to understand why this role is important. When you break it down to them as to the kind of challenges that exist and why it's important to have equity and representation and for women to participate, they get it. But that's where their work is, because you see a lot of civil society organizations are the ones that are doing the brunt of that work. Government is not educating the public on this or why it's necessary and why it's important. But I do feel that women are taking finances to another level. We are seeing a lot more women discussing how can we fundraise, how do we organize, and they're seeing that they have to be part of these conversations, because some of the sectors that really struggled is health, is education, and we're seeing how even, young mothers or those who are taking care of elderly parents tend to be daughters. A lot of times are now saying, we want these sectors to improve. And you're seeing them saying that, what can we do to make these changes? This is why it's important to have people who understand our challenges and to be able to represent us adequately. So I'm very hopeful. I think that the younger generations are more open to it. I think that we're seeing younger university students going for student leadership. The University of Nairobi has had 2 female presidents so far, and it's ever since they changed the systems. And this is important because that's also the first time a lot of young people interact through campus politics and understanding politics at that level. And we are even seeing the National Youth Council at the moment is run by a female CEO. So even though there are few specks of women in leadership, we're seeing a lot more groupings coming together and encouraging the public to believe in female leadership.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the fact you talked about this tertiary institution, because some months ago I was in Lagos, Nigeria, and we had this conversation with young female student leaders. Some of them were the first time SUG president, that's student union government president, or even first time president of their department or faculty. And it just made me realize that some of these institutions, they've been there 50 years plus. but they've never had a female in those departments leading, or in the faculty, or in the SUG government. And then it just got me wondering, like, if we can't even break the barrier at that young level or that initial stage, how are we then going to fare in the larger society? And so, Adora, you've done a lot of work when it comes to media engagement. What are those innovative ways that we can leverage, especially using the media spaces, both mainstream and new media, to promote participation and address some of the stereotypes that we see that limit women?
Okay, first of all, I'll start to touch on the part that you talked about, the school, the environment. And I think it's such an instructive conversation because it then brings me to education reform. And when I'm thinking education reform, I'm thinking foundational learning for younger girls, even from primary school, to begin to engage in civic engagement, to begin to understand women in leadership, young girl voices in leadership, advocacy. And I think when they start that young, it's easier to mainstream them, to begin to really look at their skill set on time and cognition. And coming to what you're talking about in terms of how can the media help, I think that the media is doing a lot, but it needs to situate itself.
Yeah.
And when I mean situate itself, I say, let's go back to the newsrooms. How many of the percentages of the storytelling is inclusive? What is the quota or percentage of stories that go out there are about women? And, I have really extensively worked on this. I have written to the National Assembly as a group. We have worked on how we can work with NBC to look at quoting the conversations that happen at the news desk from the editorial desk to become inclusive. How many women make it to the front pages as headlines every day?
Yeah.
How many of the women within the political parties are being amplified? So it starts from how we use this data that we already have existing to maximize the potentials of the women that we have. And then secondly, I must say that we have a lot of unions, we have a lot of associations, civil society organization. Can we also situate inclusive advocacy? And I say this, that when people go to conversations to advocate either for change in any sector, can they always look at the quota within the quota? And so you're talking about women. I'm also thinking the minority within the women group, which are the women with disability.
Yeah.
And so I hear a lot of agitation from them saying, oh, this special seat bill, this extra seat, we do not see ourselves in the numbers. We do not want a situation where we have this bill passed. Women with disability will say, hey, we're not carried along. We're not in that statistics. We want our own bill. It then takes us back to the drawing board. And I think that is an important thing for us to begin to perhaps rework and bring them closer to the table and say, how do we meet each other halfway? Then you also have ageism, where you have younger women who say, oh, when this bill passed, all the women, all the elder sisters within the CSOs who have been advocating would have the first share of the bounty, if I can call it that. And, so you begin to have that agitation. So I think that we must begin to deconstruct these structures and say, everybody come to the table. Let's all have a conversation on what works going forward. And I think in doing that, it makes the work for the media easier because then they can situate. And then I would also say, I will give you an example. I've been in a conversation where a man called in onto the live program. And he said all these conversations people are having about advocating for women in politics, women in governance, women in this, blah, blah. Women don't like themselves. After all, it is only Sarah Jibril that voted for herself. And then I asked him, how long ago has this been? This is like as far back as 2007, 2000, it's donkey years ago. So the question is, how are we doing our own storytelling? Amplifying the stories that work for women. How can we use the data? For instance, Ireti Kingibe won in the FCT. Many women voted for her, whether it was a tsunami or not. There is data to prove that women voted for her. How do we take that data off literature, amplify it and say, these are the numbers of women that voted for this woman to become a senator, and more women can also be voted by more women voting. Then we begin to demystify the fact that something that happened 10 years ago still resonates as the, memorandum of understanding for the rest of us, So I think that the media needs to do more work in investigative journalism, maximize data, collaborate with, data gathering agencies to be able to fact check some of the stories. And then I'll finally end my bit by saying we need to also stop looking at the gender identities that stereotype women. I mean, you go for interviews, they say, what is your work-life balance? They don't ask men that question,
Exactly.
you know, and they ask you, how do you juggle the children? How do you juggle going to the salon? How do you juggle? And I'm like, that is so sexist, because again, you're empowering patriarchy to make it seem like the men too don't have a life. It's only the women that have to multitask. And so that again brings for the conversation on, you know, on equal care burden. So you find out that more women would rather say, oh, I'll wait till I get married till I run, because then if I run now, they'll say, oh, I'm not married from where I come from. And then those who are married are told you can't go for meetings at night. So those kind of stereotypes, it's the job of the media to demystify them so that women can essentially have a safer space to participate. But when that will happen, how long it will happen, it's a work in progress.
Okay. So let's get personal now. I like the fact where you said that in a live broadcast, a man called and was asking, why are they always talking about women representation? That is an experience you've had. So your personal experience, such as that, how has it shaped you in advocating for women representation in governance?
I think I think very much so. I would say that that's why we continue to advocate, and that's why we are having this conversation. But I also go back to what Cynthia asked me earlier about writing a book, because I think that's the first example, I would say, inspiration. And it came from running an election in a very patriarchal system where a female had never dared, talk more of a female my age. And so it had to do with me working against cultural, you know, it was intense. You have your uncle walking and say, what are you doing here? You used to tie my shoelace during the December and, you know, Christmas period. And then you have your auntie say, you will not hear, oh, you will not hear. You leave this place where you still have the chance. So, you know, you have those kind of things thrown at you in that kind of space where those spaces are supposed to first be your primary safe space.
Yeah.
So when you get that kind, you know, it sort of throws you off balance, and then you realize that there is much more work to be done from our communities, from our families, from the engagements that we have. And so that sort of amplified my desire to start from talking to the women within the family spaces and also begin to engage women who had dared to run. Because what I saw was that those women who had dared to run, who had, you know, faced this kind of tsunami, I'll call it, from patriarchy, had said and resigned that they would never, you know, run in anything called E. I'm not even talking about election. The word E frightens them, talk less of when you explain it to be an election. So there is yet that closure for those who had dared to run. And then secondly, for those who are in the space, it's smaller and it's conscripted. And so if you're not within the boys' club, you cannot get the girls in. So you must be able to think like the boys, work with the boys, you know, make sure that they have your loyalty first. And to bring in a female, another female, it may be for them, a lot of asking, because you are asking them to disrupt, you know, their give backs. You're asking them to disrupt their comfort zone. And they do not also have legislature backing them. So again, it goes back to, if we have the numbers through legislation, the women will feel more comfortable to advocate based on principle. But if there is no principle of engagement, the women will feel conscripted within a circle to retain their spaces rather than advocate and open up the spaces for more women. So it's give and take. You either build a fence around them for them to be able to allow you to leap over, or they build the fence themselves and lock everyone out. And that's actually what's happening. And I would say this, my experience has taught me one thing. It's taught me to say that it's not for one person. It's not for just the female. It's both for the men to be in the room. I think that co-opting the male voices, having male allies, whether it's at the local level or at the urban level or within the civil society or even the legislature, is very important. But I must say this, we must be able to carry them along in such a way that the language we speak is one of a united front. If not, they would also feel like they have something and they're back against the wall.
Yeah.
Okay, so, Narima, I want to hear your answer from your own personal experience.
Mine is, I was actually just nodding my head the entire time because so similar. I was even like, I need to introduce you to a friend of mine who was also in the elections commission here, and it was a very dramatic 2017 election, and we're still very, very close. But my personal experience is a little bit different because my husband is a politician, and he was vying for member of parliament under the current ruling government party. That in itself was quite something, because of just the way I was dragged through the dirt because of standing for representation, and we have had to be allies. So I like that last point on having male allies to also push for inclusion. It's extremely important because there were moments, there were times that if we didn't have the same vision, I don't know if we would still be married. It's very difficult in that kind of atmosphere. Yes, absolutely. And I would also say that in some rooms, sometimes I've experienced that you're put in a room to represent. I've been in that situation before. I was in an eminent panel during the elections, and you know, like mentioned, you have these very, very high level. It's now about influence and now building that influence, which also takes time for people to even accept your presence and you not being a token. So being silent in those rooms, I think that's also another thing. Dealing with imposter syndrome is something that I'm constantly talking to women about. I mean, I feel like it's almost double for you because again, you end up being the only woman in the room sometimes, and the voices in your head constantly tell you can't do it. You're not even supposed to be here. So even those societal beliefs, you realize that, oh my gosh, they're seeping into me as well. So you're constantly also giving yourself pep talks constantly, and also just speaking while even you are shaking, which is something that I had to do yesterday as well at a press conference. So I think that whole balance is tough because there's also this we have Martha Karua, and we call her the Iron Lady, but when you sit with her, she's like, I don't like being called Iron Lady. I really don't. Like, why do I have to be iron? Like, why can't I just be a lady in leadership? You know? Yeah. So you're constantly like, oh my gosh, this balance of femininity. And, do I have to be like the men to receive respect from the men? Building their persona. I think it's encouraging to have other women in that space to just extend a hand and to build solidarity with is so, so important as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'll just bring both of you in quickly. What would be one thing you think it's important to get more women into the room? And then two, your call to action. If we can have, I'll start with Adora and then Nerima.
I would say legislation, special seats. I'm hopeful that we can get that passed to have more women in the room and on the table. And I'll say godmothers. I would say that it's not about the age, it's about the purpose. I've seen quite younger women, feminists, they did that for the NSAS, and that's actually godmothering, a process. And I think if young women can come together and decide and say, I think 2 or 3 or one of us have the capacity, can we solidify and build solidarity against ourselves? We don't have to wait. It's not about ageism. And that's what I needed to establish, that godmotherism is not how old it's the purpose.
The purpose.
Yes.
Godmotherism is not how old, it's the purpose. Nice. Nerima.
Politics, affects everything. And people, especially women, finding what is of interest to them and how that's politically linked. We found once we broke that down, we had more participation, especially at the community level, from women now choosing to engage just because they saw the impact of the engagement. So that's my call to action. And as far as what's important, I agree completely. And I also think, as crazy as it sounds, during periods of crisis, it is the women who take the mantle of leadership.
True.
Yes, from Great
Absolutely.
Britain to even when you think about the Bible, Deborah as a judge. I mean, any moment, it is a woman who will come to the fore and lead that country to prosperity. And so I normally tell, especially a lot of Kenyans, because we're really going through it here. I don't think Nigeria
I'm
is
so sorry. We are going through it together.
I've been seeing a lot from Nigeria, but we're constantly saying this is clearly a call that Kenya is ready for a female president, a woman president. And so people are already entertaining the idea. So I'm excited over the next few years.
Oh, I mean, I love the excitement. I'm hoping we would also be excited. You know, in Ghana, they had their first female vice president.
Yes.
I remember before the elections, I was shocked when I saw that the presidential candidate at the time, the current president,
incumbent, yes.
had a woman as a running mate. And I'm like, if this is in Nigeria, this guy will lose this election. But how courageous, you know? But for some reason, that worked because we spoke with someone from Ghana, Esther, and she talked about the fact that they were intentional because they knew that women were also a very strong voting bloc. And having a female presidential or running mate was also a plus to his campaign. And so I realized, okay, this makes sense. And I want to join with this excitement. We have a vice president. We have Namibia, a female president. Perhaps Kenya is the next to be celebrating soon. Who knows? Nigeria will follow suit soon. But it's been an interesting conversation so far. You know, just listening to both of you share your perspective around participation and representation. We're just talking about women vote, women and protests. You talked about the end-time. We think about the Kenya protest. We followed the protest like we were Kenyans. Every day we were following up on the... But I saw a lot of young women. I mean, you yourself, Nerima, you were one of the very active voices at the time. We saw a lot of women in that.
Yeah.
So you see, women are part of advocacy for social change, advocacy demanding accountability, calling against oppression and discrimination. So we participate. If you think about it.
Absolutely.
And so we've done a lot participating. It's time to get to representation. And I'm hoping we get to that. This episode and this season actually sponsored by GIZ, African Union Aware Project, that is focused on promoting women representation in Africa. And I'll hand over to Queen CY to appreciate our guests and the guys behind the scene.
Thank you, Adora, and thank you, Nerima, for coming into this episode of the Unamplified podcast. We really appreciate you guys. Thank you, and we look forward to inviting you for our other episode coming up soon. So thank you, everyone, for listening to us, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on all social media platforms, on our Instagram, TikTok, X, Facebook, and we would like to give shout out to our crew members behind the scene. Shout out to our sound engineer, DJ Drexx. Shout out to our cinematographer at Fredcoker. Shout out to our director extraordinaire, Hamilton Odemenam. Shout out to our other cinematographers who are assisting, Ifeanyi and Austin, and our other co-hosts who are not here with us today. Shout out to Ayomide and COAC.
You know, when we planned for this conversation, our biggest question was, we hope a lot of young women listening will be inspired to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely.
Because at the end, we need to dare. You said to dare to run.
Absolutely.
And I'm hoping that whomever is listening, whether in Kenya, in Nigeria, or in other countries in Africa, would be thinking about running for office, because we need to get more women into the space. Thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of this episode, and like we always end, when you're on,
You're amplified.
Cheers to Africa.
Cheers.